Right. And mentioned that a lot of it is about control, right? So do you think it comes from a societal sort of sense that the woman is the man's property? Is there a sense that she, like the sense of wanting to control and wanting to put her in a place or manage her, so you
I think that there are both elements. One is the element of entitlement and property and rights over her. But the other element, which is impinging on the man, is that I've got to be in control of my emotions of every situation. And men are very afraid to be vulnerable. So if I don't know what to do in this situation, I start to be very panicky. Why must that be? I enjoy conversations with women who can talk about a situation and say, I don't know what the answers are, but I'm willing to explore it. For many men, they look at me and say, well, if I don't have the answers, why should I go for counseling? How can a counselor have the answer? So he believes that he should have the answer to every issue in his life, which if you put that on yourself, that's going to drive you around the bend.
So we've talked about how some of the issues are, say, the sense that, the only emotion society allows men to feel is anger, or the sense of entitlement and control and all of that. So how do we, but you are obviously men who have rejected those ideas and have embraced other ways of being men. And how do we encourage, and how do you encourage other men and more men and how do we work with, say, boys and men to change this idea of masculinity, to not associate masculinity with aggression and violence, and allow, this idea that boys can't cry, boys can't do any of this. How do we start to change all of
that? If I may, I'm just taking a leaf out of this idea of the fathering movement, where boys are looking for a sense of identity, and back to Sean's example, it's about the schoolyard pecking order. Everybody wants to be, the top dog, and everybody wants to feel that if I can emulate this person, then I'm a real man. So I think boys, like perhaps women too, are looking for some form of modeling, positive modeling. And if fathers can be that model, even if the father's modeling to say, son, there are times I messed up. There are times I don't have the answers. But it's not the end of the world. There are times I made mistakes, but it's not the end of the world. I think we live in a society today in Singapore where we feel we need to know all the answers. We need to be in complete control of our lives. But that's not the real world. There's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of chaos.
So role modeling vulnerability, that it's okay to cry, or it's okay to What do you think, Calvin?
Well, not reinforcing gender stereotypes definitely is the way to go. So, to follow up on your point about parenting, for instance, there is a tendency for a lot of parents, for instance, to say things to girls, for instance, oh, that's such a pretty dress. Oh, you look so beautiful and pretty today. Yeah, but we hardly say that to boys, right? Boys tend to be rewarded more for exhibiting masculine characteristics like roughhousing, and even when boys get into fights, for instance, right? Some parents say, "Oh well, he's a boy, so it's."
Or it seems like it's a cool thing, right? Like you've been the fight, like.
Yeah, that's right. So I think parents being aware of how their parenting styles reinforce certain gender roles is important. But I think as men also, because you will need to be aware that the fact that we are men, we have privilege and are often seen in positions of power. So whenever we talk about issues which affect women, whether it is women's rights, violence against women, etc., to be mindful to hear their voices and to stand in solidarity with these women and not necessarily speak for women or always wanting to be the one to dominate the conversation or the discourse, but to be aware that women's voices, especially disempowered women's voices, are heard more. So I can relate to this, especially in my line of work, where I work a lot with domestic workers, and it's often the case that we tend to advocate for domestic workers rather than advocate with domestic workers. And even among the domestic worker volunteers I work with, they often look up to me and say, "Oh, so what is your opinion? What should we do? You know, you are the boss, right? You are the Singaporean, you are the one who's Chinese, you're the one who's male. So we want to listen to you and we want to know what you think."
Yeah.
So the huge challenge in my work is facilitating this process where my power is reduced and goes back into the hands of the domestic workers, so that they eventually are the ones who speak up for themselves, and it's not always me doing it. I will admit it is not easy, and I haven't reached there yet, but it's still a work in progress, and it's something which I think as people, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whatever, we need to be aware of the kinds of social privileges that we have, and to critique that, and to ensure that those voices which are marginalized are heard more.
Can you give an example of how you have managed to achieve that in some senses in your work with domestic workers? So, like they represent themselves. What are some examples where that's changed? Yeah.
Well, what we do now is we organize capacity building workshops for domestic workers, which are rights-based. So we will talk about what are international labor and human rights standards, and we encourage them to go for conferences and workshops where they can represent the community. So now, for instance, whenever there are opportunities for my organization, Home, to be represented in conferences and all that, I will try as much as I can to ask my domestic workers themselves to go, rather than I go or my colleagues go. But admittedly, that's difficult because they live in a society which still marginalizes them. So for them to even find time to take leave, to go for these kinds of events is difficult, and you need to have a very understanding employer who's willing to do that. So the process of empowering the workers is hampered a lot by not just attitudes of society at large, but even rules and regulations. Say, for instance, domestic workers are not, migrant workers, for instance, they will find it very scary to organize an event at Hong Lim Park. If they do that, they run the risk of losing their employment. Or it might be more difficult for them to be critical of government policies and, with the media, because they're always thinking about whether they will lose their jobs in the process. So there are lots of all these challenges, you see, that we have to contend with. But what I can say is that despite these challenges, we still have to start somewhere. And what Home we have done is we started organizing them through these workshops, these events, building their capacities, also building their confidence. Because they're often socialized into thinking that they shouldn't have a point of view, that they should keep quiet. So these kinds of workshops, these kinds of activities will also help build this self-esteem.
So, you know, this dynamic that we've just talked about, where there's men have more power, are more visible in society, have a bigger voice in society, and this is a very particular example, right, of domestic workers are one of the most disenfranchised groups, and how you as a man advocating for them need to balance that power. But in more everyday ways, how do you think men can create more understanding? What can men do to give women back that power in everyday relationships, to make sure that they're not taking up too much space making most of the decisions, whether it's in the family, whether it's in the workplace? How do men give women, use the power and position they have to elevate women's status that is rightfully theirs?
I think it's just being able to go against the grain. That's it for me. I think one very brilliant example is that I hang out with my friends and whatnot, and so sometimes they bring their girlfriends home. And so one day, this guy and his girlfriend start having this little argument, and the girl says, "You never listen to me, you always cut me off when I speak." Okay? And the guy says, no, you're imagining. So she talks to me later privately, and she says, "Oh, you work in human rights, you work in women's rights, you understand what I'm talking about." And then she points me towards this study that was done that showed that women, women don't feel that they have the space to speak up. And when they do speak, sometimes they're not taken Seriously, and so this caught me quite off guard. I said, how could this be happening in this world that I live in? And so I went to look it up, and I found out it was true, and the results have been replicated many more times. So with this awareness, when I see it happening, I can sort of divert the flow of conversation, not say back to the girl, but to give the woman at least 50%, at least her voice. It's just this little thing. It's so small. Just being aware of it, and it makes a world of change. And she comes back to me and says, "Hey, I can see that you actually picked up the study and you learned something."
Yeah, there are some really interesting studies that show, for example, that in a group, whether it's at a workplace or outside of it, when a woman says something, and 5 seconds later, a man says the same thing, that everyone's like, yeah, that's true, and they didn't even hear her say it the first time, or how the number of times women are interrupted when they speak, tend to be, and so, like, how do we help each other, like men, how do men help each other become more conscious of these things, and then could you speak in the context of, like, in a relationship, how does that play out? How do we encourage more equal relationships that acknowledge boundaries and acknowledge everybody's voice in decision-making power?
I think it's also teaching a couple in a relationship how to tune in a little bit more to each other, to understand, to hear. Unfortunately, sometimes when people are in a very unhappy state and they are quarreling, we tend to speak in terms of demands, we tend to speak in terms of ultimatums, you better do this, if not, So sometimes I try to get in terms of a request, and this is my point of view, and all I can do to my partner is just to help you understand where I'm coming from. And, just the listener, having the discipline to say, now can I paraphrase what you say? That's so difficult, because we tend to listen with our preconceived notions and assumptions. But if a couple can learn to hear each other out a little bit more, then you find that the other partner isn't trying to cut you off at the knees, and the other partner isn't trying to put you into a corner. That all she's asking for is for a little bit more understanding, a little bit more support. And if the man can say, well, I can do that, and I can listen. Very often, the women in the conflicts that I see, the couple conflicts I see, said, all I need him to do is just to listen to me. I'm not asking him to move mountains. I just want him to listen to me. And really, if you replicate that many times over to big societies, that's what we're looking for. How to reduce conflict between communities just by having more understanding and more communication.